Okay, welcome back. Here we are. We're going to be talking today about the 1930s. Really fascinating decade. 1930s in American history through the American lens. And I'm breaking this lecture up in a few parts. The first being the Red Decade, which I'm not exclusively about that, but mostly about communism, why it's so massively popular at this time. We'll look at a bit about that, historicize that. Then we'll look at the response to that by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, New Deals 1 and 2. And then just a bit of a chat there about some encouragement we can take from this time period, which we desperately need for our own times. Always use that. Then we'll look at racial integration a little bit, a bit of an awkward segue into that, but talking about that and sport in what is called the golden age of several U.S. sports, including baseball, though golden, maybe not so much if you think of it on a racial level, integration being fairly limited, but we'll talk about that. Jesse Owens as well, and why this matters so much. And that's our segue to then begin talking about the origins of World War II. And really what I want to get home here is World War II as an ideological battle. And yeah, and so with that, you'll be introduced to a couple points about what is going on in Europe, specific to Italy and Germany, prior to the official beginning of the war in 1939 with the invasion of Poland, 2 years prior to the Americans getting into it. Okay, so that's where we're going today. I hope that you find lots of great information here. And as always, any questions with anything, let me know. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so let's start this lecture with the fact I left with last time, this point I made that with the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932, we get a fundamental sea change in the relationship between Congress and the American worker. And it is a change towards socialism, towards what we would call socialism. So a massive economic shift happens. And it is done in order to save, and that's the paradox here, in order to save capitalism. And one only needs to get into the 30s to understand what I'm talking about here. And what you see, and you can quantify this easily, is the massive uptake in the appeal, and for some, the appeal, for others, the threat of communism. Right? Party membership in the Communist Party USA goes from 7,500 at the start of the decade to 55,000 by its end. It's a massive increase. They become a big player. And who they're focused on mostly is they're pulling in the most desperate, those with the least to lose, that is the unemployed. And so for the first time in the 1930s, we will see communist marches in most American cities, especially in the West, where the Great Depression is its worst, and in the South. We see the Communist Party USA establish what are called unemployed workers' councils. These are very effective. They mobilize protests in any given city against anything, whether it's evictions or perhaps it's relief office closures, and that's happening more and more as cities are going bankrupt, trying to keep people alive. And they'll demonstrate for things like unemployment insurance. Now, these protests, because these communists can never get a permit to march, that means they will be met with police violence for illegal marching, and that only adds to the militancy of the party and its members. The CPUSA is also very actively involved in the major strikes of the decade. And perhaps the biggest one of all is the San Francisco General Strike, which is a good case in point of how that worked. So 1934, San Francisco General Strike gets sparked in May of that year by a longshoreman strike. These are the guys that keep the port operating. And here it's the CPUSA under an Australian, actually, by the name of Harry Bridges, who lead the strike committee. Now, workers shut down the port. In response, police end up killing 2 strikers. And then it becomes a citywide general strike of all union workers. So general strike, 150,000 San Franciscans are in unions. They are all off the job. Now the city effectively is shut down. And it only ends after 4 months, by which point 9 people have been killed. Now, the legacy of this is basically it's a victory for the communists. Every West Coast port ends up being unionized after this because message is out that you can't fight this. Now, what we get is, as I said, organized protests. You get sit-ins at relief offices. You get demonstrations demanding unemployment insurance and whatnot. There's even a march on Washington in 1932, summer of 1932, by World War I veterans. Now, this is a really moving and touching march. It's about 40,000 men. It's about 40,000 people. It's veterans and their families, their wives, their children. And what they want, what they're asking for is pretty simple. It's an immediate payment of a bonus certificate that they earned for service in World War I and that they're due to receive in the 1940s. And now with the Great Depression, the crisis, with the desperation, they want to get that early. They call themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Forces, the BEF. They come to Washington, they camp out, and Hoover doesn't like this one bit. So completely tone deaf, he sends in the army to get rid of them, and that's tanks and all. This is under tanks, the tank division under Douglas MacArthur. He clears them out. So here's these veterans. They're being gassed. They're being shot at. Two of them are killed, and their property that they have here, their things are all burned. Now, the CPUSA is not instigating this, but it definitely capitalizes on this. It supports the marchers. It even publishes this songbook that you see there with illustrations and all. These are these great old-timey Union songbooks, right? This thing is going for $300 on eBay now. The Wobblies really minted that. You take popular songs and you make them, you change the lyrics, and you put out these songbooks. The IWW pretty much a spent force now. Now the communists are doing it. In any case, throughout the 30s, that's the point. You're seeing headlines continuously of communist marches, and that's both in the States and in the Western provinces of Canada, which are equally desperate. Now, this is not what North Americans are used to, but these are unique times. A good example of that, both the state of Arkansas and the province of Alberta go bankrupt. They default on their debts. At the same time, millions of Midwest farmers are losing their very land in the Dust Bowl. And that's just this cruel coincidence of the Great Depression, that we have this 8-year drought that only ends in 1939. You've got children growing up with never having seen rain, essentially. You've got 2.5 million people that migrate out of the panhandle of Texas, Oklahoma, that Midwest region past the 100th meridian, which are marginal lands, right? And which should never have been settled, as we've talked about before. But A, they're not conducive to non-irrigated agriculture because less than 22 inches of rainfall per year. Secondly, this lack of understanding of dryland farming. So now we've had a couple generations that have not used conservation methods. They're not understood. So there's this annual and biannual deep plowing that hugely contributes to erosion and to dust storms. So with that, we have, as I said, 2.5 million what we would call climate refugees, and they're heading mostly to California, where they end up in migrant camps where the communists are also active. In any case, the CPUSA is well understood to be a friend of the unemployed, also of the tenant farmer, both white and black. And if you're interested in more of that, see the book Hammer and Hoe about this history. I believe it came out in 1990. The communists and the sharecropper and the support for the farmers in America in the 1930s. But also see Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath for a contemporary critique of capitalism. If you haven't read that, no shame, but do it. Any case, communists are getting a lot of sympathy also, especially with the intellectual class, and that's a good segue from Steinbeck, with writers, with the lost generation of World War I, basically with the American left in general. And that only starts to grow over the course of the Depression. And you see that particularly during the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939, when guys like Hemingway and George Orwell and a lot of others will go to Spain to join the communists to fight the fascists over there. Okay? So in the 1930s, to be a communist meant being anti-fascist, and that really matters. To be a communist means you're anti-fascist, and there's a lot of idealism here. Okay? These are what we would call the more thoughtful people, the intellectual classes who are upset with uh, uh, there's a racial element here also. That's part of what is motivating them. Okay, and I. Yeah, the CPUSA very deliberately supports African Americans. Again, another point I want to make, pays their legal costs in anti-lynching trials and promotes anti-lynching laws, and famously defends anyone in the South who's been convicted or who's being charged with rape, which happens all the time, right? Or semi-frequently anyway. Most famously, they defend the Scottsboro Boys. This is not the only case. This is the most famous one, where the Communist Party USA is financing their defense. Now, this is a group that was falsely accused of raping a young white girl, and they all initially get the death penalty, all but one of them. The CPUSA spearheads this global campaign to save them, and it funds their 4-year-long series of appeals, really long series of appeals, hiring this Jewish big-name lawyer Samuel Leibowitz. Now, he's not a communist, and that really underscores the fact that they're really serious about supporting. This is not just ideological for them. They are serious about supporting the African Americans with the best talent they can get, and ultimately they do win. In any case, the 30s really was a red decade, as per the title of this journalist, Eugene Leon's, his book in 1941, A Red Decade. He really nails it there. And yeah, National Hunger March, 1932, another example. The CPUSA brings over 75,000 workers and unemployed to Washington to demand relief and unemployment benefits. You've got the Harlan County War in Kentucky that sees massive conflict between striking coal miners and mine owners, with the CPUSA providing support to the workers. You've got the Minneapolis Teamsters strike. You've got Toledo Auto Light strike. You've got the all sorts of examples of CPUSA involvement in labor disputes in the 1930s. Sit-down strike in Flint, Michigan, in the auto industry, on and on and on. All in all, their actions as CPUSA in the 1930s, particularly through these unemployed councils, really contributed to the rise of industrial unionism and the broader union movement in this period. Now, most Americans are not becoming communists, and a lot of communist sympathizers are not in the CPUSA, but wherever you are on the political spectrum, this is frightening to you, and a solution must happen, and it's not coming from Hoover. The crisis is 3 years long by the time Hoover is punted from office in the 1932 election. Now, nobody would have survived in office given the depth of the crisis, but least of all, a Republican who just didn't understand how significant it was. And what you want to understand here is Americans vote for a leftist approach. FDR runs on the promise of, quote, a new deal for the American people. And he was clear that this included a commitment to providing unemployment relief, which didn't yet exist. To this point, care for unemployed fellow municipalities, which are all overwhelmed, as I said. He's also promising public works programs. He's promising that the feds will open their wallets to get people working on roads, on dams, on whatever, make work projects. He's also emphasizing the need for government intervention to stimulate the economy, provide social support. Again, how he defends this idea of the feds opening their wallet on public works projects. So what we get here is a key shift in how people think of the role of the state. And this is what since then has been called New Deal capitalism. And Americans vote for FDR, and who, by the way, is a distant cousin of Teddy Roosevelt. And they vote for him in a massive landslide. He takes 42 out of 50 states. Okay? And yeah, right away, he is jump-starting the economy. He's reforming the financial system to prevent future crises. We talked about that last time. Key initiatives that happen under the first New Deal, as it's called, the first, what he has promised here. We'll get the second New Deal in a minute. Civilian Conservation Corps is part of that, the CCC. You've got the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the AAA, that supports farmers, and you've got the National Recovery Administration to regulate industry. You've also got the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, created to restore confidence in the banks, which we already talked about last time. So this is the first New Deal, and it happens during Roosevelt's first 100 days in office in 1933 until 1935. And though its origins are pretty well understood, there's this really rich debate that continues over the efficacy and the legacy of Roosevelt's unprecedented federal intervention in the economy, and why it was, in the face of all these efforts, that really unemployment remains so intractable, because it doesn't shift the needle much. Okay. Now the consensus is, as much as there is one, is that the first New Deal really wasn't ambitious enough. Okay, so it protects the economy from further declines, it saves the banks, it saves the railroads. It doesn't do enough to help working class, hungry Americans, particularly African Americans. And in fact, some of the policies made their lives worse. So I'll give you an example of that. The AAA, and these are all called the alphabet agencies, because there's just so many of them by the time the New Deal wraps up. But the AAA, what it did is it limited production, right? So part of the problem is overproduction and the response of people to plummeting prices. And by the way, grain prices have slipped to a 300-year low, accounting for inflation, from over $1 a bushel down to about 7 cents. Okay, so it's just been a bottoming out, and that's the same is true of cotton and pretty much every other agricultural product, okay, but not to that extent. In any case, the AAA is meant to limit production in order to keep prices sustainable or to stabilize them. So what it does is it's paying landowners and farmers not to work their lands. Now this means, of course, that more and more field workers who don't own their lands and are employed in these farms are losing their jobs. So over 100,000 sharecroppers lose their work and homes as the feds pay landowners to not plant in the South. So yeah, it can have a reverse effect. In any case, when FDR is reelected, he implements his second New Deal, which goes a lot further towards solving the crisis. So the second deal is 1935 to 1938, and somewhat an admission that the first deal has not come through. So it's basically the feds opening up their wallets wider and being more creative and more imaginative, more federal projects, broader scope. In particular, the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, is established, and it's almost an umbrella for a whole lot of other things. All sorts of museums, park buildings, civic buildings are constructed. The WPA is busy in the parks, the national parks. It's busy with something as simple as you see here in this image, sidewalk rehabilitation or sidewalk construction in American towns. But it's also the feds hiring unemployed artists, novelists, poets, playwrights. So you there have an image of a painter painting WPA workers. They're both being paid under the WPA dime. And yeah, this is all through cultural subsidized programs under the WPA aegis. $1.3 billion per year is their initial budget, and they are putting millions of people to work. 8 million jobs are created by the WPA for the 8 years that its program runs. Its various programs, which are all shuttered by the early years of World War II. We also get the Wagner Act now in the second New Deal on child labor, which we've already talked about. We get the Social Security Act. Now this is massive. This is old age benefits for anyone over 65. This is also the first unemployment insurance in America. It's also disability and injury benefits to workers. And it's also a framework for the individual states to provide more, specifically healthcare support for disabled, for seniors, and the poor. Basically, this is what would later be organized in the 1960s as Medicare for seniors and Medicaid for the poor. And in some ways, ideologically, what we see here is the beginning of the end of the concept of the deserving versus the undeserving poor. And this is the old approach of charity, which was run by nonprofits or by municipalities, but always with a bias toward those who had middle-class values and conventional lives. Now, this is all very expensive. FDR is pulling out all stops to save capitalism here. 16.5 billion is doled out on the Second New Deal. And to put that into perspective, it increases the federal government's share of the GDP, of the gross domestic product of the country, from about 4 to 8%. So it literally doubles the size of the state. It's a massive expansion of its role in the economy, and one that is never reversed. It only grows. And today the federal share of GDP is 23%, $6.7 trillion annual budget. Yet the Great Depression really doesn't end till mobilization for World War II. So why is that, in spite of these massive numbers? And some say, economists, that it still was not enough. It was too tentative, even the Second New Deal. Also, there were a lot of loopholes in it. So as much as it sounds great, the numbers sound impressive, anything that is run at the state level tends to be less so. And for example, most women and minorities do not benefit from Social Security because their work is intermittent, seasonal, or it's agricultural, and that is not included. So states do not have to include these workers under the Act, and most of them do not. So mainly it is whites with full-time jobs who benefit there. There's a book on this you might want to get called When Welfare Was White. Okay, and it gets into exactly that. The NAACP, the National Association of Advancement of Colored People, called Social Security, in practice, they called it, quote, a sieve with holes just big enough for most Negroes to fall through, end of quote. Single mother whites fell through it too, though. So an example of that, to qualify for help for poor children, the mother has to be at home. Okay? So most states specified that. And most states would also exclude children who are born out of wedlock, so what was then commonly called bastards, right? They would not get support. Less than half of poor Americans ended up being eligible for any federal Social Security benefits. Okay? So many benefited, but less than half. But one thing the Second New Deal absolutely did, and the New Deal writ large, first and second, is it gave new hope to Americans. Okay? And that's especially true of the WPA. Federal Writers Project alone got 7,000 writers work. It's a real lifeline at this time. The Federal Theater Project put thousands of productions on. It hires urban poor, whether they're black or white, and one example of that, Orson Welles. He puts the play Hamlet on with an all-black cast in New York at a place called the Mercury Theater, all funded by WPA money, which is unprecedented. Theater companies are set up in 11 cities. There's a federal music project. There's a federal art project. And this is a time where, because FDR is widely seen as progressive and seen as a friend of blacks and minorities, it sees a shift in the attitude towards the Democratic Party. Right? Democratic Party to this point is seen as the party of white supremacy, the party of the South. Now it is a national party. It straddles both sides of the Mason-Dixon line, but it is the party of white supremacy in the South. And African Americans are being prevented from voting in the South, as you know, and they won't vote until the mid-1960s. But even so, FDR now is gaining a reputation. And when these African American voters there do win the vote in the 60s, they will remember they had a friend in the White House who was a Democrat. And so the federal Democratic Party is becoming the party of the poor. And that's a massive shift that's really, really important. Now, before we leave the New Deal, I just want to say that my last point here is that I find it really encouraging that Americans voted left. They voted for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They voted for socialism, a planned economy, and the National Resources Act really was that. It set levels of industry, level plans or production plans for different industries. It's an incredibly interventionist model. Okay, it's a planned economic system that is going to save capitalism at this time. And I could have dwelt more on that, but you can look into that yourself. But in any case, in 1935, Sinclair Lewis wrote this book, It Can't Happen Here, about, it's a dystopian fictional novel about this dictator taking over in America in the context of the crisis of the Great Depression, and in the context, too, that that is the solution that is happening in Europe, in Italy and in Germany and in Spain. So, and rich conversation in Europe about fascism. Most of those Wilsonian states of the post-World War I era were no longer functioning democracies by the 1930s. Right? Almost all of them have gone either to the far right or to the far left. Right? Democracy is pretty much a dead letter in all those new states of the Versailles Agreement. So this is a rich debate at the time. And is democracy in retreat? And yet Americans vote not for another Harding or not another Coolidge. They're not going for a Klansman. They're going for the opposite when push comes to shove. And that is a super encouraging message from the past. And it resonates to today. In 2018, Madeleine Albright wrote a book warning Americans that this president they just voted for, Donald Trump, could very easily and would very easily, given something like a 9/11 type event, that type of crisis of that magnitude, would suspend the Constitution, would become a dictator, would suspend civil liberties. And we've certainly seen elements of that in Trump's second presidency. So just an encouraging message from the past that in the biggest crisis Americans ever faced, they did not vote right. They voted left. Right? So any case, in as much as you can use history to draw lessons from, which yes you can and often you can't, but here's one that should be fairly encouraging. Okay, so I want to get back to race as we go on. So having completely messed up my segue from talking about race in the second New Deal and then my political statement there, which I just gave you, I can't come back from that. But in any case, completely different direction here. No segue at all. Sports matters a lot. And in the 1930s, we can't talk about the 1930s, I guess I want to say, without mentioning that as well, that African Americans are having a comeback here in rejoining organized sports. What's interesting is that blacks had been integrated in a lot of American sports in the 19th century, but then the progressive era kills that. Okay, the black as beast ideology, social Darwinism, and all the rest of it. So their comeback is a sign of the changing times, the Harlem Renaissance and all the rest of that we've talked about, the Great Migration. It's also a function of franchise owners wanting an edge and seeing a profit in letting blacks into the boxing ring, as in the case of Joe Louis, or later baseball with Jackie Robinson, both extremely gifted players. And because of that, both of them are opening doors for a lot more. Like all who lead, they put up with a lot as they break down this wall. Robinson was afraid to play baseball in the South because of fear he'd be taken out by someone in the stands. And he played Montreal in the minor leagues in 1946 for the Dodgers farm team, and then went on to play for the Brooklyn Dodgers the following year. But at one point, when he was being chased by adoring crowds in Montreal, he said something to the effect of, "It's probably the first time a black man was chased by a white mob who basically didn't want to lynch him, but wanted his signature, his autograph." In any case, Joe Louis comes before that, and it can't be any better. Joe Louis, his timing in the 30s, in that he defeats both Italian and German world champions. Okay, so that can't be a more beautiful direct victory against the pseudoscience of the racists, a direct score against what the fascists are saying, their messaging, right? So Joe Louis is considered the first of the national black sports heroes in America. And he opens the door for Sugar Ray Robinson and others, and Jackie Robinson after the war. Max Schmeling, he takes him out in a rematch in 1938. Okay, so growing equality in professional sports is another theme of this era, but it has limits. Yeah, there are definite limits to that equality. And you see that in Berlin in the 1936 Olympics with Jesse Owens. Now, on one hand, a great story. Jesse Owens takes 4 gold medals in track and field in an Olympics that's meant to showcase Germany's having kicked the Great Depression, invites the world to come out to this big party, invents the torch relay, and really is this message that we're not the thugs that a lot of people say we are, right? All the anti-Semitic signs come down. Reporters are bribed actually to write good print about Germany, and it works very well. Other than this, right, Jesse Owens showing the pseudoscience of race here. Hitler had told Speer that Albert Speer that blacks should have been excluded from the games because they, and this is his theory, that clearly they are designed by race for exactly this kind of thing, so it's not fair competition. He also wouldn't shake hands with Jesse Owens. But here's the thing: he didn't shake hands with any but German medal winners. Okay? What matters more is what happens when Jesse Owens returns to the United States. And he famously says this: Hitler didn't snub me; it was FDR who snubbed me. The president didn't even send me a telegram. More disturbingly, there's a ticker tape parade to honor him in New York City, and then a banquet, and he is not allowed to take the elevator or go through the front. He has to take the back, get in through the back, and take the stairs to his own banquet. Okay, so segregation is clearly a massive problem yet in the United States, even though its integration in sports is starting to happen. Okay, so that's one more theme in the 1930s I simply wanted to give you before we shift gears and get into World War II, which actually our segue is right there with Joe Louis, because these African American sports heroes are being used for propaganda by the American Army during the war. The interesting thing being that the U.S. Armed Forces, and this again gets to the theme we're talking about, is not integrated. Okay? So while African Americans are off fighting against racial pseudoscience in Europe and against Nazism, we have inequality on the home front and the armed forces not yet being integrated, and the South still being this hellish backwater for African Americans, where lynchings still are happening, not with the frequency that we saw earlier in the century, but certainly integration is a long way off, right? So the paradox, and this is one of the themes of World War II for America, that it really casts a spotlight on this disconnect between what Americans say they are fighting for in that war and what things are like on the home front. And that's probably a good place to end this lecture on, is in setting us up for World War II. And the big point I want to make here as we close is that World War II is as much an ideological crusade as it is a military one. And the Allies are keenly aware that this is a moral battle. They see it in their time as a battle pitting Christian civilization against neo-paganism and twisted science. And the propaganda plays on that. Churchill himself is very clear on this, and here's what he says there in this long quote from his finest hour speech. Now, he gives this speech right after the fall of France, and he says, the Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. If we fail, he says, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say this was their finest hour. Now, this speech is as much or even more for the American audience than it is for the British, and it really sets the tone for the whole war. Churchill's trying to say you can't stay out of this war, and we'll get into that into our next lecture, how Americans are drawn in, much like World War I. The tone, though, is clear. It's of a crusade against Hitler's perverted science, his division of the world into Untermen and Ubermen. And bringing that home here, these images that I'm giving you, the image on the left is of Albert Speer's redesign of Berlin, which will now be called Little Germania, and that's really important. Okay? Little Germania. They're reaching back to antiquity here. Albert Speer, Hitler's chief architect, and what Speer is doing is he's drawing his inspiration from the Palatine in Rome. And in the Palatine, you had Emperor Augustus build his palace on one end, and then the Temple of Apollo is on the other end. Here we have a mirror of that, where you have the Volkshall on one end, which was going to be the biggest building in the world in terms of how many people it could house at the same time. And on the other end is the Chancellery, Hitler's government building. He is the Reich Chancellor. Okay? And it speaks really powerfully to the neo-paganism that Mussolini and especially Hitler are trying to recreate. Hitler has a hate-on for Christianity. He sees it as a slave religion, unfit for the German temperament. And just like Nietzsche, he's going back to antiquity for his model of civilization. See, the ancient Greeks and Romans had these powerful gods, and not incidentally, in antiquity, the emperor himself is worshipped as a deity, as a god. So, and we see the same with Mussolini, at least in one sense. He invents fascism, and the one main value of his ideology is really a rejection of the fundamental message of Christianity, and is that violence is not abhorrent. It is something to be idealized, and the willingness to use that is heroic, and violence is idealized as the solution to complex problems. Okay? That is one unique thing you can say about fascism. So yes, and at the risk of belaboring this too much, we really have to put this lecture to bed, but it is a fascinating topic. You know, there's a reason Nazi architecture and statuary, as well as Italian, looks like it comes directly from ancient Rome, and that's because it's supposed to. There's a reason the SS looks like the Roman Praetorian Guard, and that's because they're supposed to. They look exactly like them with their shiny designer suits by Hugo Boss, no less. I always wonder why people wear Hugo Boss proudly when given where he made his fortune. There's a reason, more importantly, that Hitler is talking about taking over Eastern Europe and is about to unleash hell on these people, and that Mussolini is already doing that in neutral North African countries like Ethiopia, and calling the Mediterranean Mare Nostrum, which means our sea, which is exactly what the Romans had called it. And the reason is simple. They're living in a different time by different values. Now, the problem for them being is they're really not. And historical amnesia may play well at home, but there's a dangerous denialism here that Mussolini and Hitler will have to confront. And namely, that's Britain and its empire, it's Russia, and worst of all for their chances, it's the United States. But for now, as in World War I, and that's where we'll close, Americans again do not want to fight. So we will start there next lecture. Okay, I hope that was good for you, and if you have any questions, for sure, let me know. Take care. Thanks for listening.